Today, I'm going to start off with a story. My dad told me this, but I don't know if it's true or not. Anyways, there was a church near a distillery owned by an atheist. The distillery was getting on the nerves of this church, and after talking with the owner, the church was frustrated. So they had a prayer session about this distillery, during which lightning strikes the distillery, burning it to the ground. The atheist owner turns around and sues the church for having God burn his distillery down, while the church strongly denied such. In court, the judge says, "I'm confused. The church is denying that God had the power to burn down the distillery, while the atheist is claiming that God did have the power and was the cause of the lightning." Think about what the church claimed, that God didn't have the power to burn down the distillery. Effectively, they were denying God and his power. We've seen this many a time in the Bible. Today, we'll be looking at why we could or would deny the Lord. Reason number 1, fear. If we were scared enough for any reason, would we deny God? For example, look at John 18, verse 17 and 24 through 27. In this passage, Jesus has been arrested, causing the disciples to scatter in fear. Simon Peter has already been questioned. Peter said he would never deny Jesus, but when he got scared enough, that turned into a lie. Verse 17. Then the slave girl who kept the door said to Peter, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now look at verses 24 through 27. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, "You are not also one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the slaves of the high priest, being a relative of the one whose ear Peter cut off, said, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter then denied it again, and immediately a rooster crowed. You see, Peter was scared, so he denied the Lord not once, but 3 times, just as Jesus had told him would happen. But John the Baptist was the opposite. He stood up to King Herod, telling him his relationship with his wife's brother was improper. Standing up to a king had to be scary, but John stayed true and was imprisoned and later even beheaded for preaching the truth. Would you and I be that strong like John, or deny God because of our fear of losing our life like Simon Peter? Reason number 2, greed. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, David sees a woman named Bathsheba bathing. He wants her for himself, to the point where he conspires to have her husband, Uriah, killed. In fact, he even makes Uriah carry his own death note. This is pure greed, through and through. David was king over a nation and already had wives, but wasn't satisfied with that, and resolved to essentially murder to steal the wife of another man. Every terrible action here is driven by David's want for Bathsheba. If you wanted something that badly, would you deny God? Thankfully, not everyone is as weak as David in that moment. Turn to Hebrews chapter 11, verses 24 through 26. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to endure ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, considering the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. Since he was found in the river by Pharaoh's daughter and adopted, Moses was groomed to be a prince of Egypt. He was offered riches beyond imagination and plenty of respect and honor. Instead, he opted for the reproach of Christ, considering that to be better, aligning himself with the enslaved Jewish people, battling Pharaoh, and being exiled from the country. Hopefully, we would be as strong as Moses to make a decision like that, choosing God over greed. Number 3, power. This ties in with greed a little bit. In 2 Samuel chapters 15 through 18, Absalom was a power-hungry man who attempted to dethrone his father, David. He pushed David into temporary exile, had a campaign, and even went so far as to publicly sleep with David's concubines. He was so obsessed with the idea of large amounts of power that he practically tore down the kingdom to get it. Those who are as power-hungry as Absalom will go too far to get what they want, denying God by not listening to what he says about coveting and being content in our situation. But once again, there are people who will not deny God, even for great power. A great example of this is Jonathan, who, as the son of Saul, technically should have inherited the throne, but recognized that David was the Lord's intended heir. So he didn't try to challenge David for king, but instead was his best friend and biggest supporter. Who would we be in a similar situation? Absalom, who mowed down everybody in his path to get that power he wanted, or Jonathan, who stepped aside to let David get the glory when he knew that was God's plan? Number 4, lack of trust. In Numbers 13, the Israelites sent 12 spies to check out the land that God said would become theirs, Canaan. A little while later, 10 of the spies come back saying that there was no way they would be able to take Canaan, that it was a land of strong, large people, while 2 of the spies had faith that with God's help they would be victorious. The people didn't trust in what God promised and listened to the 10 spies denying God, which cost them another 40 years in the desert and death in the desert, so that none of the adults would ever get to see the promised land. Would we do the same? Would we be overwhelmed so much that we didn't trust what God had promised and let our faith falter? Or would we be like the 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, who kept their faith in God's promises that the people chose to ignore? While they did admit the people were strong, they were still convinced that with God's help, the land could be theirs. After another 40 years of wandering the desert, what was left of the Israelites finally got to take Canaan. And when they made it into the promised land, a stone was placed by Joshua, one of the spies, for the people to remember what God has done and never again deny him. Let's look at Joshua 24, verse 27. Where this action is taken. Joshua said to all the people, "Behold, this stone shall be for a witness against us, for it has heard all the words which the Lord which he spoke to us. Thus it shall be for a witness against you, so that you do not deny your God." You see, people deny God all the time for many different reasons. Sometimes they claim to follow God, but their actions tell a different story, as stated in Titus 1, verse 16, which says, "They profess to know God, but by their deeds they deny him, being detestable and disobedient and worthless for any good deed." We've looked at a few examples of the denying of God today. We need to strive to not deny God in our daily actions, but to praise him, because denying God has consequences, as shown earlier. Matthew chapter 10, verse 33 says, "But whoever denies me before men, I will also deny him before my Father who is in heaven." Denying Jesus means he'll deny you entry into heaven. Maybe you've been denying God in your actions and need to confess that. Or maybe you've been denying God by putting off baptism. Think about this. 2 of the examples we looked at today came back to God. They repented, and most importantly, God was always willing to welcome them back. In the first case, the Bible states that Peter wept bitterly when he realized how he had denied Jesus. Jesus promised that Peter would be the rock upon which he built his church, and Peter became just that. On the day of Pentecost, Peter got up and boldly proclaimed Jesus in front of the multitude, baptizing thousands. In the second case, David repented also when Nathan pointed out his sin to him, tearing his clothes in remorse and even paying for his sin with the death of his child. David faithfully served God all his life, and the Bible calls him a man after God's own heart. However, in the last two cases, they continued to deny God to the bitter end. Absalom never repented of his ways and died a horrible death as a punishment for all his wrongdoing. And as I previously stated, the Israelite adults who listened to the 10 spies instead of the 2 were condemned to another 40 years wandering the desert and to die there, never seeing the promised land they had so longed for. You see, you have the choice: deny God or follow him.
I think Elijah has identified well the things that cause a lot of people to deny God. What is of interest to me is that we get upset with people who deny God, and rightfully so. We're upset when there are people who campaign against God and make laws against God and outlaw God in certain places, rightfully so. But what about those of us who claim to be God's people? Do we proclaim him? Oh, we get upset when people deny him, but are we on board with proclaiming him? Jesus said at one time, you're either for me or you're against me. In other words, they were in one of the places where Jesus said you could possibly be, one of two. We're not denying him, but are we proclaiming him? And if we're not, then we're in the same place where they are. So we should. The passage in 1 John. 3 things that give us reason to say we ought to proclaim God. Number 1, we ought to be able and willing to proclaim God because of who God is. Verse 17, as he is, so are we in this world. As he is. Who is God? Well, God is the only answer for the beginning of all things. There is no other answer without God. In his class this morning, Joe McCleary was talking about teaching his children when someone says, well, the Big Bang started it all. Then you ask, where did it come from? Then you ask, where did it come from? Where did it come from? And you just keep going. And he said, the answer we got to was cosmic sludge. The next question is what? God's the only one that makes any sense when it comes to the beginning. And because of who he is, we ought to proclaim him. But number 2, he's the only one that gives meaning to life. The only one. Why should anybody be nice to anybody else? Why should any one of us be good to anybody else? Why? If there is no God, then in fact, I could argue we ought not to be good. I could actually make the point that if there is no God and there is nothing after this life, then I would suggest that we not be good. In fact, we ought to do whatever we can to get the most out of this life that we can. Because this is it. And if this is all there is, then you better get all you can. So God ought to be proclaimed because he gives meaning to life. The reason we're good, the reason morality exists is because God does. If there was no God, there's no sense in talking about morality. Number 2, We ought to proclaim God because of who we are. Did you see what the text said? As He is, so are we in this world. Well, I think that obviously means we're made in the image of God, Genesis 2, and we are. We're made in the image of God. What is John saying? As He is, so are we. I think he's saying being made in the image of God makes us His agent. And as His agent, what do? We give people information that helps them understand the beginning of life. And we give them meaning to their lives. Because we have meaning. And because of God, I not only know where I came from, I know why I'm here. And as His agent, as He is, so are we. We ought to know and be able to defend where we came from. And number two, why we are here. But third and finally, verse 19. We ought to proclaim God because what He did for us. What did He do? God made the first move when we could not move. That commercial that has been running for, it seems like years. The commercial of the lady who falls in her kitchen. I can't get up. And it's advertising the self-help, the life alert button. I've fallen and I can't get up. A personal experience of a lady on the radio talking about it the other day said, I lay in my kitchen for 5 hours until a neighbor finally came and found me. Now I admit, there are times when I'm down on the floor and I'm playing with the grandkids that I've been there a while and it looks really funny watching me get up. It really does. In fact, I get so tired of it, I've decided 2016, we're going to fix that. I'm going to do something. I'm either going to quit getting on the floor or I'm going to exercise my legs better. So I've never really been in a position where I absolutely could not get up. But that's what we were spiritually. We couldn't get up. I've fallen and I can't get up. And God made the first move to say, okay, I'll take care of you. And He sent Jesus to die for the sins of the whole world. Number two, He made the first move then to remake me. Because sometimes I sin and I need forgiveness. And God said, if you confess, I'll forgive. So, because of what He did, I ought to be willing to proclaim Him. I don't think any of us are really in the camp of those who deny God. We're in the camp of being upset over those who do deny God. But we don't seem to get quite as perturbed with Christians who don't proclaim God. Why is that? If we're so upset over people who deny the Lord, but not upset over people who don't proclaim the Lord, there's a problem. Because those people really are just like these people. Don't deny God. And that means proclaim Him. There are only two camps. You're going to be in one. Jesus said, you're either for me or against me. And every one of us ought to be willing to proclaim because of who He is and who we are and what he did. So tonight, before we leave, are you ready to be on board with the Lord more fully? We always want to make sure that if there's someone here who needs to get his or her life right with the Lord, that you have the chance to do it. And if you'll come and let us know how we can help you in any way while we stand and sing together.